Welcome. I'm Steve Call, and I'm the president of the New America Foundation. It's my pleasure to welcome you to our regular Friday or New York Luncheon and Salon series. I'm experimenting as I do the introduction with what level we need, so it'll come up, I'm sure, as I go along. Yeah? Is that better? Okay. And we'll test when Daniel and Amjad start to talk. Just briefly, for those of you who may not be familiar with the New America Foundation, we're a 10-year-old think tank headquartered in Washington, D.C., and with a strong presence in New York and California as well. We work with about 100 scholars, journalists, writers, and policy specialists out of Washington and our satellite offices, and we are devoted to bringing forward important new ideas about public policy in areas that address the most critical challenges facing the United States over the next 5 to 15 years. And in these times, you can imagine it is a privilege to be doing the kind of work that we do. If there was ever a moment when a think tank's role in public discourse and national life was of critical importance, this is the time. And I think we all feel very animated and engaged at New America by the opportunity we have to try to transform some of the incremental and conventional aspects of our politics at this moment of true transformation in national life. As we've organized our work on economic policy and domestic policy and foreign policy over the last couple of months, looking out over the next couple of years, we've organized ourselves around the theme of transformation because I think, as all of you can recognize, the country is in the midst of a transformational period. And it is, to some extent, transformation that is being thrust upon the country by, in some cases, destructive forces in the economy and abroad. And to some extent, it's an opportunity to shape this crisis so that the country that emerges from it is transformed and poised to reemerge as a beacon of both domestic strength and equity at home, and also of equilibrium abroad. And a lot of the time when we're up here in New York, we talk about our work on economic policy, and we have some programs coming up that I'll just very quickly mention. One in March, I think some of you will be very interested in, on the 31st, previewing the G20 summit that's going to take place in London, and Bob Hormats will be here, and Richard Medley, and from our offices in Washington, Doug Redeker, to talk about reform of the of the world's financial system, whether the United States will lead, and if so, in what way. But this sort of framework of transformation and of trying to get past the debilitating ways of incremental and partisan Washington also is an aspiration in our foreign policy work, and that's what brings us here today. And I think you'll see a lot of New America's kind of culture and way of working in the conversation that we're about to have. I'm just going to briefly introduce Daniel and Amjad, and they'll each speak for about 5 or 10 minutes, and then I'll take the chair's prerogative to ask a few questions, and then we'll open it up to all of you and make this a conversation. We've got a large group here, but please feel free to stick your hand up and to intervene and to join the discussion. Daniel has been with us now for what, 2 years? Yeah. And he's a senior fellow and co-director of the Middle East Task Force at New America. You can read this, but I think it's important just to set up the conversation by making clear how deeply and creatively each of these two speakers has been involved with the Israeli-Palestinian peace process for 10 years. Daniel was the lead Israeli drafter of the Geneva Initiative and directed policy at their headquarters in Tel Aviv once the campaign began. He served as a senior policy advisor to the Barak government and has been involved in Israeli politics and intellectual life for many years. you've probably seen him quoted in the media here over the last couple of years. But he also writes under his own sail quite frequently, both in Israel and in the United States. Amjad has been with us only for about a month, and when we organized he and Daniel as a team to lead this task force, we had in mind taking advantage of this moment of transformation in American foreign policy thinking to think big thoughts and to write our way and think our way back to the strategic opportunities that had seemed to fall apart over the last 4 or 5 years, and to really think afresh about where the opportunities for a two-state solution reside and how to revive meaningful, practical pathways to get there. And that's what we promised Amjad his job would be about. And almost as soon as he agreed to come over, we had Gaza. So we've been mostly in a much more crisis reactive mode, and in that sense parallel the experience of the incoming administration in a way I'm sure the two of them will talk about, because it's very difficult to look out on the horizon when this is the heart of the transition. I just make one last. So Amjad is co-director with Daniel of this Middle East task force, and he's an attorney who has worked on international governance and rule of law issues outside the Middle East as well as within the Middle East. He's been a very important part of the Save Darfur coalition. He's worked in Kosovo, and he was also an advisor to the Palestinian negotiating team in the negotiations with Israel on international border security and constitutional issues during elements of the Madrid process. So the easy stuff is what Amjad's usually worked on. And I just mentioned one thing about this forum. A couple of you, I think at least, were here maybe 6 weeks ago when Anne-Marie Slaughter and Fareed Zakaria had a similar discussion. And for those of you who don't read the gossip papers in Washington the way some of us do, I had the pleasure of going to dinner at the State Department last week, where Anne-Marie hosted a big ideas meeting for the new secretary in her new job as Director of Policy Planning at the State Department. So she's taking these kinds of conversations now right into the transition, and I think that's going to be a theme today. So which of you goes first? Have you sorted that out? Amjad.
That gives Daniel the right of rebuttal. I appreciate everybody. Sound? Hello?
Good. Let's hope that they'll. Why don't you keep talking?
Okay. So, well, I appreciate everybody coming out today. I'll lower my voice as the mic comes on, especially it's such a cold day. We've been talking a lot about how this moment in the Middle East can be transformative for the United States. But the difference between recognizing that we need a transformative moment and knowing how to get there, of course, is a very wide difference. About 5 years ago, I was sitting with a Palestinian negotiator, one of the ones that I was most close to. And the Palestinian negotiators had developed a kind of almost manic depressive. They would be up and down on any given day, depending on what they heard from Washington. And so on any given day, they might be very excited. On any given day, they might be horribly dejected. But on this particular day, the negotiator said something to me that none of them had ever said to me before. We were sitting alone. It was just the two of us. And he commented that is this? Yeah, much better. He commented to me that he said, "We're not going to get a state, are we?" And I just looked at him and I said, "Well, it doesn't look likely now." And he said, "It's not going to happen. I mean, Bush isn't going to do it." And I was like, "Well, no, he's not." And he shook his head and he said, "We're just out of ideas. I don't know what to do. We're just out of ideas. We don't know how to take this further." And the problem that occurred to me later when I thought about that conversation was that, it's the story about the frog in the boiling water. If you throw a frog into boiling water, he jumps right back out. But if you put frog into tepid water and then slowly turn up the heat, the frog will burn to death, boil to death before he realizes that he's being boiled. And when you're in the middle of a conflict and you deal with it every single day, that happens to you. It doesn't matter if you're an advisor to the negotiating team, if you are the negotiating team, if you're the best diplomats in the White House or in the State Department. When you deal with the conflict every single day, you don't necessarily notice just how bad it's getting. The gradations begin to blur into each other, and it becomes hard to think creatively about out-of-the-box solutions on how to resolve the conflict. And we know exactly what that's like, of course, because we have a financial crisis that we're all forced to deal with, not just as Americans, but everyone in the world now is forced to deal with. And a lot of people were warning us about this financial crisis for many years before this, but it was very difficult to act on it. It was very difficult to deal with it. I mean, I remember I was thinking back, and I couldn't count how many articles in The Economist I'd read. I'm not an economist. I barely understand finance. And I just remember how often they would write about the collapse of the housing bubble that was coming, and whether it would be a hard landing or a soft landing and what it might mean. And I still went ahead and bought a house. And it was difficult to take this kind of big picture drama and transform it into how we're going to change our daily habits. In the Middle East right now, we're looking at the same thing as the financial meltdown. We're looking at a collapse of the structure that we've been using and trying to utilize over the last 20 or 30 years. But we're not quite sure where in the collapse we are. And we're still thinking in terms of what are the small things, what are the slight gradation changes, what are the slight small things we can do to make things a little bit better. And I'll give you some concrete examples. Right now, President Obama is undoubtedly getting advice from a host of people who are desperately urging him to stay the course, to stay steady and not to think big, not to try to change the dynamics of the conflict overall. One of the ways they're going to push the idea, and I'm not saying that this is out of ill intent. I think, again, these people have worked the conflict for 20 years or more, and so they're doing what they've done in the past. They're doing what they think works. And so one of the arguments you hear is that we're going to have to help Abu Mazen and increase his security forces. The irony, of course, is that every time the United States has helped, quote-unquote, Abu Mazen has gotten less and less popular. We haven't been able to wrap our heads around the fact that the popularity of a Palestinian leader is directly connected to their ability to either defend Palestinians from Israeli occupation, remove the occupation, or at least offer the promise of an end to the occupation. And if you cannot do any of these three, then you're not going to have any resonance, no matter how popular you may be in Washington, no matter how popular you may be in Paris or in London. And Abu Mazen is trapped in this category right now, where his friends are telling him, if you have a better security force in the West Bank, that's going to transform things enough that we might be able to then convince the Israelis that maybe there should be a slowdown in the settlement construction, maybe some of the checkpoints should be removed. It's the conversation we've been having for years and years and years. And it's something like a stimulus check. We'll get a refund in the mail, and then we'll go out and we'll spend it, and that'll help give the economy a quick boost. The problem, of course, on the security front is that it's going to be impossible to have Palestinian security forces, and Israel has found this over and over and over, that will defend Israel's security at the same time that Israel's building settlements in the occupied territory. You can do it for a brief amount of time, sometimes 2 years, sometimes even 3 years, while the Palestinians think that there's a chance that the settlements are going to be removed, or while they think that there's about to be an agreement. But to build up the security forces and at the same time expect them to provide security indefinitely for Israel while Israel develops and integrates the West Bank into Israel means that what you're going to end up happening is Israel's going to go into the West Bank in 1 year, 2 years, or 3 years and deconstruct the Palestinian police forces as it did in Gaza with Hamas's forces. The other argument you'll hear is economics. We've got to help the Palestinians live better lives. And if they live better lives, they'll be less likely or less prone to engage in violence. Of course, each of the intifadas began when the Palestinian economy was actually on an upswing, not a downswing. And the truth of the matter is that there's no such thing as an economy a real economy in the sense that we understand it under the conditions of the occupation that the West Bank and the Gaza Strip exist in. There is no free flow of trade. There is no free market capitalism. There's a hostage market that has to buy goods from one particular source. It cannot export its goods. Most of the trade is done through monopolies. And then, of course, a lot of people blame the Palestinians for having the monopolies, but they have the monopolies with Israeli companies. So the Israelis and the Palestinian companies that are engaged in the monopolies or in the industries are the ones that benefit. And, of course, the people don't. Ultimately, this takes the edge off of starvation. For example, the West Bank is not nearly as desperate now as the Gaza Strip is. But it doesn't transform anything. It doesn't transform the attitudes of people. Just yesterday, a poll came out in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip that basically showed that the anecdotes that we've been hearing from everybody on the ground are, in fact, at least they're shown to be empirically true according to the polls. Abu Mazen is much less popular now than he was before Israel invaded the Gaza Strip. Hamas is much more popular. The number of Palestinians who support, who believe that rocket fire can be an adequate deterrence to Israeli actions in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip has increased to about half the population. The number of Palestinians who believe that violence against Israeli civilians is legitimate has increased from about 30% to almost 50%, or a little bit over 50%. These changes are all tracked directly to the course of the war in Gaza. Now, how the new administration is going to be able to deal with all of this, one of the things that I remember telling my friend who was the negotiator, I'm not using his name on purpose, but one of the things that I said to him then was, you know, it's okay if you don't have ideas, and it's okay if I don't have ideas, but there are probably lots of other people who do have ideas, and you've got to open up the system enough to let those people give you those ideas. Fatah, unfortunately, at the moment, has found it almost impossible to convince itself that it can open up to new ideas without being supplanted. And the problem is that when you don't open up yourself up to new ideas, other people with new ideas anyway propose them and then try to take the initiative. Hamas tries to take the initiative and tries to benefit from the lack of ideas, from the lack of success that Fatah has had. Now, it's not all doom and gloom, though. Some of our allies are doing the same thing, and they're actually positioning themselves in a better place to help us deal with this crisis. But there's a danger that we may not recognize that that's what they're doing. And I'm referring to Turkey and Qatar in particular. Iran, as you know, has obviously attempted to capitalize greatly on the war in Gaza and to position itself as the true friend of the oppressed, the true friend of the Palestinians, and provided significant rhetoric and rhetorical support to the Palestinians. But the same poll showed that, in fact, the leader in the Middle East, well, the leader in the world, who has the most support among Palestinians right now is Prime Minister Erdogan of Turkey. Now, it's interesting because Turkey is a NATO country, it's a U.S. ally, it's an Israeli ally, it has a strategic partnership with Israel. Israeli warplanes practice over Turkey. None of that's changed. Turkey hasn't changed. When the parliament told Erdogan that maybe we should back up all this rhetoric with some action and we should change our relations with Israel, he commented something to the effect of, we're running a state, not a grocery store. In other words, we have our strategic interests and we have the things that we need to say and the things we need to do. The ability of Turkey to express tremendous outrage against the Israeli actions in Gaza, but not change their strategic relationship with Israel, and their ability to position themselves as an interlocutor with Hamas, means that rather than Iran being the most powerful and potent force in the Middle East that can have an influence with Hamas in the coming period, the country that has the greatest ability to influence events or to talk to Hamas leaders, to convey to them our concerns and our ideas and what we believe needs to be done, is in fact one of our closest allies. Now the same thing is happening with Qatar. Qatar, of course, hosts our base, the U.S. military base, where all of our operations in Iraq are run and where our operations in the Gulf are based. That hasn't changed. They'll continue to be that ally. But they've also been adamantly opposed to the Israeli destruction of Gaza. Now we can compare that to our other allies in the region who went the other direction and supported the previous administration's rhetoric on the war in Gaza, which is Egypt, Jordan, even Saudi Arabia, to a much lesser extent Saudi Arabia, but Egypt and Jordan. Now those countries, their leaderships have, at least among Palestinians, fallen as far low as they have ever. Inside their own countries, in Egypt, there were demonstrations taking place where Egyptians were holding up banners that said, "Forgive us," to the Palestinians, because we're not in charge. This can be potentially destabilizing to our allies in Egypt, etc. But it means that we need to think creatively about how we can use the creativity of our friends, like Turkey and Qatar, to try to fill in this idea gap that exists right now. One of the concerns that I think Daniel and I have been pushing for, what we're arguing about, is that there's actually a danger. It's going to actually make it more destabilizing to continue with the same kind of incrementalism and the same kind of ideas that we've been pursuing under the Bush administration. This is not to say throw everything on its head and do everything exactly in the opposite way, but it does mean to do a complete audit and a reassessment of what hasn't worked, and to then identify the things that we need to do. I'll stop there and then leave the rest for the discussion.
Excellent. Thank you. Is your mic okay?
We're about to find out.
Yeah.
I think the answer is yes. Now I just have to not wriggle around too much. Well, first of all, I'd like to thank you, Steve, and Rachel for putting this together, and obviously Amjad for his comments, and you all for joining us this lunchtime. I guess I'll start with the thing that's most on my mind at the moment, if for no other reason that I'll be flying to Israel on the weekend to vote in Tuesday's election. Just to give you the latest on where things stand in terms of the polling with those elections, there's a sense, but I think that media tends to always manufacture this a few days out from an election, that the gap is closing. And that everything's up for grabs. The reason there might be more than just media hype to that is that what all the polls are showing is that up to a quarter or a third of the Israeli electorate are apparently not made up their minds yet. What we do see in this election is a consistent trend towards the right, that the right-wing parties overall are likely to have a majority, the right-wing of religious parties, a significant likelihood, with the caveat of what I just said, that Benjamin Netanyahu will form the next government. The thing that has not made itself onto the radar screen so much here, but is very much the story of this election in Israel, is a very worrying phenomenon. And I think an indication of some of the ruptures that Israeli society has gone through recently, which is the party of Avigdor Lieberman. He is he has a very distinctive brand of rather turbocharged ethno-nationalist, exclusivist politics, which is a long-winded way of saying it's a bit of a racist. And his entire campaign really is predicated around how one has to treat the Arab-Palestinian minority inside Israel, not the Palestinians living in the territories, as very much people who have to prove their loyalty to the state in order to maintain their citizenship. And it's a campaign that's caused a lot of concern, and it seems that he will lead the third largest party and perhaps be a kingmaker. The other thing, though, that's going on in Israel is a sense, I would say it's about as far away from the sense that many people felt here just 2.5 months ago as it could possibly be, in terms of there being a real sense of it doesn't matter. Of course, people will go out and vote. There's a sense that there will not be a particularly high participation rate, but there's a deep malaise based on the dysfunctionality of Israeli politics, the inability of the Israeli political system as it's structured to actually address the problems that Israel faces, and that whoever's elected will essentially muddle through. on all issues. They'll muddle through in terms of the economic challenges, which have taken longer to reach Israel, but are now very much reaching Israel. And of course, in terms of Israel's situation in the region, the situation vis-a-vis the Palestinian territories, and what Israel does next. That in many ways is an outgrowth of it's almost certain that in Israel it's a parliamentary democracy. You have to form a coalition government, and the 120-member Knesset will almost certainly have at least 12 parties represented in it. So if you think what's going on in your Senate right now in terms of trying to get the stimulus package through is tricky, then you can imagine trying without a presidential system, but as a parliamentary system, trying to manage a parliament where the largest single faction is unlikely to exceed 1/4 of the members. So although people will draw distinctions between the leading candidates, Mr. Netanyahu, a former prime minister on the one hand, Tzipi Livni, the current foreign minister on the other hand, there's not much belief either that a more centrist, liberal-leaning government could deliver peace, or that a more right-wing government will deliver something dramatically different. There is, it very much is the sense of whoever it is, there will be a muddle through. I'll add one other word on the elections, which is, to my mind at least, and I'll address now where I see the prospects for peace at the moment, and the prospects for a different way of looking at this. To my mind at least, if Bibi Netanyahu does return to the premiership, he was prime minister from 96 to 99, then I think he will do so having carried some lessons, and one in particular from his first term, which is best not to get on the wrong side of the White House. I think what Netanyahu is probably internalized is that one of the key things that led to his coalition unraveling was the way he managed or mismanaged the relationship with the Clinton White House. And I'd be happy to elaborate on that later. And I think one of the reasons that the assumption is muddled through and that nothing changes is what Amjad was talking about. That there's a sense that we're in a peace process which just about manages to sustain itself as a peace process, but doesn't actually go anywhere or demand hard choices of its participants. And I would say that that's particularly true today. And so I think anyone who's thinking about what should we do next has to ask two rather difficult questions. Does the current peace process, as it's designed, have a chance of delivering what is its stated intention, which is a two-state solution, both in terms of the approach, the how do we get there, and in terms of the destination, what is the there that we're trying to get to? And let me spend a couple of minutes trying to unpack what I mean by that. I think right now you have a very convenient negotiation with, and you'll excuse me if this comes across as an excessively harsh word, with what might be described as a domesticated Palestinian leadership. A Palestinian leadership which is a very convenient interlocutor for the Israelis, but that has insufficient traction or legitimacy with its own public, either to carry a deal or to implement it. And given that both sides know this, the Israeli side doesn't feel much onus on itself to close a deal, and certainly not to implement anything that would be agreed, because there seemed to be no capacity on the Palestinian side to do that. So one maintains the facade. Whether, as Amjad said, the facade is that you can make progress on economic efforts while you still have an Israeli presence in the territories, which by definition trips up Palestinian capacity to actually use development aid to get anywhere economically. What I mean by that is that, and this is in all the World Bank reports, the proximate cause, the main cause of the inability for all the aid that's pumped into the West Bank to actually do anything sustainable or significant is the closure in the West Bank. Some of you may sometimes read about checkpoints, closures, difficulty of movement. There are 602 obstacles to Palestinian freedom of movement in the West Bank. The West Bank is about the size of Delaware. And those checkpoints aren't there because an Israeli colonel woke up one morning and said, I've got some spare barricades, what do I do with them? I've got some spare cement blocks. They're there because there is a network of, in particular, Israeli settlements in the West Bank. And Israel is duty-bound, though they are Israeli citizens, so the Israeli army is duty-bound to defend the settlers and to defend their freedom of movement. And that implies a certain deployment of these checkpoints. So the idea that without addressing the politics, you can address the security or you can address the economics, I think has been proven for the last years to be wrong. The idea perhaps that the sides can negotiate this bilaterally, I think is also something we have to question in terms of the existing approach. The approach is sustained by the United States. The United States is the patron of the current negotiating process. So I think there are two key questions that an administration that has much more than many of us who work this every day anticipated, an administration that has really set out its stall as saying this is an important issue for us. I don't think any of us would have expected that on day 2 a Middle East peace envoy would be appointed. There was no American Middle East peace envoy for 8 years under the Bush administration. Day 2 you have a peace envoy. Day 5 I think it was, the president as his first interview with any channel goes to Al Arabiya and sits down with Hisham Melhem and gives that interview. The next day, Mitchell's on his way to the region already. You've had briefings with the envoy before he left, with him when he returned. So you're seeing an administration which, to be fair, Obama said he would do this in his campaign. He said, I'm going to make this a priority from day 1. But we actually see that they're trying to live up to that. I don't think people in the region expected that. But I think the two key questions are, number 1, will you go about it in the same way? And I would argue that one has to think differently. And you will probably need more of an external role, more American leadership than an American deference to the parties' bilateral negotiations. And the other question is, do we still assume that the destination is exactly the same? There is a general sense that we know what the solution is. And I'm most of the time party to that consensus. That if only we could create the right context for an agreement. We know what the text looks like. It was written by Clinton in December of 2000. There were the Clinton parameters. I was involved in an effort called Geneva. There were negotiations at Taba. There have been negotiations over the last year. I think we may have to re-question that. Not in the fundamentals of a two-state solution, but in some of the parameters. I don't think we can assume that when you have a different political reality on the Palestinian side, partly a reality of collapse, but also partly a reality of a resistance narrative, challenging a negotiation narrative of the last decade, and when you have a new reality on the Israeli side, of a government that is very likely to be of the centre-right coming in, that you can assume exactly the same outcome. Which doesn't mean you say, okay, we've got a right-wing Israeli government now, we have to give the Israelis more. Or we've got a more hardline Palestinian leadership, we have to give the... Can you find a different set of win-wins? Can you expand the pie? Will security be handed from Israel to the Palestinians? If Gaza is the model of what you don't do in terms of deoccupation and withdrawal, how do you do it differently? Is there an international role there? Is there a NATO role? Your new national security advisor has looked at these concepts of having a NATO. Do you have to remove all the settlements? Is it possible to have Israelis, settlers, no longer as organized communities defended by Israel under Israeli sovereignty, but living in a Palestinian state? So I think we've got to break out of that dynamic that we're locked into. And the final point I think I'd say is to add a sense of urgency to our conversation. I do think, and if Tom Friedman can say it in one of his columns last week, that all the years, the 20, 30 odd years Tom has been writing about this, every year someone would say, yeah, this is the end for the two-state solution. Today it might actually be true. So I think there is a degree of oy vayness, which I'm sure is in the dictionary, about where we find ourselves today. For me, that's particularly disturbing and worrying for Israel. Because if you don't have a two-state solution, and this is an argument that I'm sure will be familiar, it becomes very difficult to conceive of how you have a Jewish and democratic state. But I think it's equally troubling to the United States for the following reason. My assumption, and I'm kind of glad it's the case, is that the US-Israel relationship remains solid. The US-Israel relationship is a given. The problem is, what are the dynamics of that relationship if America is locked into this strategic alliance with an Israel that no longer has any good options in the region, in the Middle East, given the effect of this unresolved conflict on everything else America is trying to do? I think that's why you've seen this narrative from the Obama administration, that we have to resolve the conflict. Because it's not the fact that Israel and America are close that's problematic. It's the fact that that relationship exists while the Palestinian grievance remains unresolved. Because that saps your credibility everywhere else in the region. And we saw it in Gaza just now. Palestine is the iconic litmus test issue for the Muslim and Arab world. Fairly, unfairly, exploited, not exploited. That's the reality. That's what will still get people out onto the streets. That's why I think it needs to be a priority. And if we're going to make it a priority, I think we have to have the intellectual courage and honesty to say, just repeating everything we've been doing so far that hasn't worked might not be the best idea.
So Daniel, that's a good place to transition into a discussion, because it seems to me that both of you in your précis have circled around but not fully addressed two questions that are of the moment and that take us into this discourse about incrementalism versus thinking anew. And I want to set them both in the here and now, and with the appointment of George Mitchell as the special envoy. Amjad, you worked with him 9 years ago, so you know him. And he went out there on an advertised listening tour. And he's presumably come back, and now the discussion has begun within the Obama administration. You can probably name everyone who's at the table who matters, and you probably know what color socks they favor at this point. So it's a familiar group having a new conversation, an old conversation in a new setting. So I have two questions I wondered that each of you, first Amjad, could address. First, who is Mitchell? What does he bring by way of eyesight and character to his role? And what did he hear when he went on his listening tour from the usual suspects? Because this was more of a conventional listening tour, stopping in all of the official offices and picking up in a kind of transition mode dialogue that had been going on in the second term of the Bush administration. But what did he hear? What was he told? And then the second question is, what is the debate inside the Obama administration's advisory group in the first iteration, and what should it be?
Well, the impression that I think Senator Mitchell, when he came in 2001 and late 2000 and 2001, he surprised everybody because he was very, very, very different from the Clinton negotiating team. You know, as Aaron Miller has written extensively and stated often, I turned it on and turned it off, and now it works, right? Okay. The Israeli negotiating team was viewed the American negotiating team was viewed by the Palestinian side as being part of the Israeli negotiating team. And so they would come in with some of the more hard-line positions, argue them as if they were America's mediation proposal, and then the Palestinians would jump over them and go directly to the Israelis to try to get a better sense of what was possible. They'd get a better deal, then they'd go back to the Americans and say, well, the Israelis said that they'd give us something better than that. And then the Americans would go back to the Israelis and said, well, why didn't you tell us that you were willing to go a little bit lower? Mitchell came in with a completely different perspective. He came in as a mediator and as an honest facilitator. I mean, he could have been Norwegian, as far as anybody was concerned. He actually was attempting to figure out what was happening, what the conditions on the ground were without prejudice to anybody's interests, and then figure out what were the fundamental underlying conditions that needed to change in order to change that. Now, so that piece of, I mean, I can see how he was successful in Ireland, because he did this over the course of 5 months, and he came and he spoke with everybody. He went to Gaza. The only American official I know of that asked to go to a refugee camp. The only American official I know of that wanted to go to a hospital in Gaza, in the refugee camp, to meet victims who had been shot by Israelis. And of course, met with everybody on the Israeli political spectrum, of course, as well. Now, I think this is going to hold him in good stead. But the part that I think President Obama has to decide, not Senator Mitchell. Norway is a facilitator. Norway is a mediator. Norway will sit between the Tamils and the Sri Lankan government and try to figure out what's possible, what's not possible, what the interests of each party are, and how to balance them out. And Norway has no vested interest in Sri Lanka, but it will do its best to try to bring peace to it because it's adopted this as a national interest. The United States has vital national security interests in the Middle East. We care deeply about what the peace looks like. We care deeply about what the Palestinians do. We care deeply about what the Israelis do. So I think we need to go into this not just as facilitators. We need to go into this as negotiators. We are negotiating our interests, both with Israel and with the Palestinians. And so there's a mediation component where we're going to have to try to help the parties bridge the gap. But if we look at this, if we come into it thinking we're Norway, we're going to make sure that the process fails, because at this point, we don't have two equal parties that are in anywhere close to each other in the negotiations.
So is it your conjecture that when Senator Mitchell came back from his first tour, did he require decision-making from President Obama in order to define some early sets of choices? And if so, what decision-making is he now in need of at that level? Well,
I'll give you one immediate example. Senator Mitchell went there and obviously recognized right off the bat that in order that the ceasefire had to continue, it was vitally important that we didn't return to a war in Gaza between Israel and Hamas, and that the conditions for that ceasefire were the same as they'd been for 8 months or so, that Hamas would not fire rockets and Israel would open the border crossings and Egypt would open the border crossings and allow humanitarian aid and reconstruction aid into Gaza. So he said so. He said so while standing next to the Israeli Prime Minister. He said so when he was with the Palestinians. And he was told by the Israelis, no, that they've changed the terms of the debate. That instead of negotiating no rockets for opening of the borders, they want no rockets opening of the borders in exchange for the return of Gilad Shalit. And that was a separate track negotiation that's been taking place with Turkey's assistance in trying to negotiate the release of Gilad Shalit in exchange for any number, hundreds perhaps, of the 10,000 Palestinian prisoners being held by the Israelis. And so right now, so we're in a very, very dangerous moment because the Israelis are attempting to renegotiate what Gaza is all about. Hamas hasn't agreed to that renegotiation. There's a danger that we're going to go back into violence. The United States has staked out its position and has been rebuffed and told, no, we're not going to go down that route. This is going to happen more and more often, and the Israelis have no choice. It's in any government would want to test the government it has to negotiate with to find out how serious they are and whether they're a pushover or not. So we're going to get a lot of these little, it's inevitable, we're going to get a lot of these little tests. We'll get tests from Hamas, not from Fatah. Fatah will not Fatah is domesticated. We will not receive tests from Fatah, but we will receive tests from the Israelis, we will receive tests from Hamas, and we're going to have to, President Obama, not Senator Mitchell, is going to have an answer to those.
And so in this particular case, do you imagine that President Obama faces a decision about whether to make a call to the Israelis on this question, whether to deliver a hard message this early on the cusp of an Israeli election, or is the assumption that we're just going to wait for the next Israeli Prime Minister, Daniel?
Nothing happens between now and Tuesday. In that specific regard, you actually have an interesting period between when we're already in caretaker government in Israel, but when you're in the period of caretaker government after an election already, when someone else is forming, you can get interesting things done. Actually, it would be a very convenient time to get tough with the outgoing Prime Minister on this specific issue. And I think this will be the first issue that they have to address is the arrangements, the modalities around Gaza. You can wing it to a certain degree by using the United Nations agencies as the conduit for everything. But even when the UN is the conduit, the question is what is allowed through. So that's going to be the first test. Right now, without boring people with details, you get about 120 trucks through a day on average since the fighting stopped, of supplies. What is being delivered is the immediate humanitarian needs.
And actually, if I could just, of the 120, the UN says they need 560 trucks to keep people at 60% of minimum subsistence level. So the UN's goal is to keep the population at 60% of minimum subsistence level. So the 100 trucks are a quarter of the 500 that they need to get to that goal.
Yeah, and the key thing here is the difference between humanitarian assistance and reconstruction. In other words, it's one thing getting medicine in, getting tablets that can purify water, etc. It's another thing rebuilding what was destroyed. To rebuild, you need to be able to get in the materials that right now Israel is saying that's dual-use technology, a pipe, cement, glass. These could all
plastic bags.
Plastic bags. So that's the very first thing. It's part of a bigger picture, though, in many ways, but in this particular way. Will Senator Mitchell find himself lurching from crisis to crisis? In other words, February to April, I deal with whether I can get glass and cement through the Gaza border crossings. June through next September, there are 4 particular checkpoints in the southwestern sector of the West Bank, and we have a nice economic project going, and it can't breathe, which is very much what you end up chasing after red herrings, chasing after goats that have been placed in the room in many ways in order to be removed. And you end up a Condoleezza Rice, who, as Secretary of State, not even during the first 4 years as National Security Advisor, I think it was 24 visits in total to Israel, normally to Israel and the Palestinian territories, compared with, I think, a total of exactly half that number of visits to China and India and Africa combined. And most of the time, she would be arguing about a checkpoint here, a checkpoint there, opening. So this is something that the Mitchell mission will have to be very cognizant of, whether its listening tours end up being firefighting exercises, which may mean that you have a deputy who's in charge of those things. It's a question you have to ask yourselves. If the level of Secretary of State or of envoy is coming in to address those issues, what does that say about American power? Aaron Miller, who was a negotiator, he's written a really useful book on this, The Much Too Promised Land, has a nice phrase, Gulliver in the land of the Lilliputians. And you get dragged down to the level of being a Lilliputian if that happens. Let me make 2 comments about the Mitchell listening tour. One is, who was he listening to? he heard the cross-section of voices to a certain degree on the Israeli side, but not on either the Palestinian side or on the regional side. The regional side goes back to what Amjad was talking about, which for me is perhaps the biggest question for this administration. America's regional allies, who we call the moderates, but they look anything but moderate to their own domestic political opponents, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, etc., have an interest in saying, do this through us. We're all that stands between now and the region totally going over towards radicalism and resistance and extremism. But of course, we need some stability to be able to do that. So leave us alone on what's going on in our own backyard. Forget about the Ayman North, forget about the dissidents, forget about the opening up. For me, the question is, will the Obama administration go along with that and go along with escalating and exacerbating tensions in the region? Or will it say, okay, we have to have quite frank and honest conversations with our allies, and we have to ratchet down tension in the region, the capacity to have proxy wars, which on a regional level means Mitchell needs to be listening to the Turks and the Qataris. Maybe not the Syrians yet, and I'm not saying he needs to be listening to Hamas yet, but he'll need to be listening to a broader set of actors and trying to create a more functional Middle East. Because while you've got this dramatic internal tension, everything becomes a proxy everything. You have a meeting in Doha of one part of the divide in the Arab world, and then a meeting in Abu Dhabi of another part of the divide. And America's on one part of the divide. Until now, America has been encouraging the divide. America also happens to be on the part of the divide which is ever weakening in terms of the mood in the region. On the Palestinian side, I think Senator Mitchell will have to do two things. One is speak to a broader cross-section of Palestinian civil society. He won't talk to Hamas. I don't think America should directly engage with Hamas. But I do think two things. First of all, I can't imagine someone can come out of his experience in Northern Ireland without asking in a very pointed fashion the question, can I do this without getting the warring parties in the room? If the only people who are in the room are the people who schmooze rather nicely with each other, they can make peace in a way tomorrow because they're not really at war with each other, but they can't do anything with it. How do I do that? How do I do that given the restrictions? Is there a division of labor? Are there other third parties who are talking to Hamas, who I can use slowly, indirectly, discreetly? And I think the principal question is one of intellectual curiosity. My biggest criticism over the position towards groups like Hamas of the last administration was my sense, at least, and I may be being unfair, that there was a lack of intellectual curiosity. To treat all manifestations of political Islam as being the same meant that rather than saying, okay, there's Al-Qaeda, who we can't deal with, and then there's a whole world of political Islam, nuanced, many of whom are in a bitter struggle with Al-Qaeda, many of whom want to be part of the democratic process, many of whom are constituency organizations, so they have to be attentive to their publics, and one didn't try and get into the weeds. And that's the challenge.
That's the heart of the Hamas. Why don't we open?
Well, right. Hamas is the one negotiating with Israel over the terms of the ceasefire in the Gaza Strip. But they're not. But neither Hamas doesn't recognize Israel. Israel doesn't recognize Hamas. So they negotiate with each other through third parties. We need to be part of that. And so we can be in the same position as Israel for all practical purposes. We refuse to recognize Hamas. We're not talking to Hamas, but we're talking with Hamas. We're finding ways of having Hamas communicate messages to us like they communicate them to Israel. And we're finding ways of communicating messages to Hamas just as Israel does. It's strange for us to be in a position where we're going to be, I was about to say more Catholic than the Pope, and it doesn't work in this context. We don't have to be in a position where we're being holier than thou.
More kosher than the rabbi.
More kosher than the rabbi, thank you, I was looking for it. We don't have to be more kosher than the rabbi on this. And it's functionally necessary. it's functionally necessary in order to get Hamas to stop doing the things that we all find abhorrent. And it's necessary to also find out what, we missed. There was an excellent opportunity that, okay, so I'm sure many volumes of books will be written on the missed opportunities of the last 8 years, but there was one in particular that stood out for me in context of this. In 2006, after Hamas won the elections, which were widely considered the freest and the fairest in the Arab world, the heads of Hamas traveled to Turkey and then Iran. And in Turkey, they gave a speech in which they said that Turkey is an excellent model for Hamas to consider for a future Palestinian state in terms of an Islamic government over a secular state, an Islamic party rather, ruling a secular state. And then they went to Iran and said, thanks a lot for all your support.
Right.
And it was a moment.
But that begs the question. So if I'm President Obama or if I'm Senator Mitchell and I accept your advice and I say, look, okay, I'm not going to be more kosher than the rabbi. Let's get on with indirect context. What is my strategic goal? If I'm going to fashion evolving tactical contacts, do I believe in a unity government that is ultimately persuaded by its own internal dynamics to recognize Israel and come back to the two-state bargain? Am I looking for some other outcome? If so, then what is the other outcome that I'm trying to get to?
Well, I mean, one is we already have an example of a unity government between Hamas and Fatah, in which that the Saudis brokered at great financial cost. That they can afford it. That said that Hamas and Fatah would create sort of a technocratic government to rule the Palestinian cities in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, and Hamas would agree that Fatah would negotiate vis-a-vis the PLO with Israel over a permanent status agreement. But any agreement that they concluded would have to be put for a referendum. If the referendum passed, Hamas would implement the agreement even if they didn't support it. Now, that is a bare minimum, I think, of where we can get back to. There might be even further that we can get if Hamas has become, if there are elements in Hamas that are even more pragmatic.
Is that European strategy today, basically? Is that formula?
In a very declaratively and in a rather soft and kind of itchy way or uncomfortable way. But I think that's more of a product of how difficult it is for an EU of 27 without a constitution and without the internal reforms, how difficult it is for Europe to do common foreign and security policy, and of them not wanting to get out too far ahead of the new boss in Washington. I mean...
And so inside the Situation Room, if that advice had just been offered to Senator Mitchell and the usual advisors, the array of advisors who are actually going to shape this were there, what would the range of attitudes within the Obama group be to that target, that strategic target?
I think the major pushback right now against that position is the following, and it goes back to what you were, the direction you were pushing us in earlier, Steve, which is what are the broad outlines of the thinking inside the Obama administration. I think there is a line of thinking, or I know there is, that looks back on the effort of the last period and says the design flaw in Annapolis, in what the Bush administration was trying to do to strengthen Palestinian moderates, to strengthen Abbas, so that they can be credible with their own public, they can regain popularity, they can come to the negotiating table and secure a deal. The flaw in that was that you didn't live up to the commitment to do the things that would strengthen them. You didn't get the Israeli deliverables. If there was a commitment to free settlements, remove outposts, bring down the checkpoints, if you deliver on those things, the logic is still fundamentally correct. And I think that's the debate.
Between that position and those who say, no, it's not about Israeli deliverables. It's about...
Between that position and the position that says, number one, are we engaging in a fruitless exercise to try and get those Israeli deliverables, because you end up expending American political capital to get nickeled and dimed to death, where I know the Israeli system. I know exactly the arguments that we in Israel will come back with. Well, of course, we're not building any new settlements. We're not really expanding, but there are 7,000 housing units that are already on the market being you can't, it's private, you can't prevent that. So once we finish that, of course, we don't need to do any more. That keeps you busy for the next 2 years. Think things like this. Between those who say, why expend the political capital on this? And also who say, you need to heal the Palestinian polity. If the Egyptians and Europeans and other Arabs are being serious now about trying to heal the Palestinian polity, trying to create rules of the game that will re-legitimize whatever Palestinian leadership emerges, let's stay out. Let's perhaps send a different signal. I mean, I think it's the do the previous approach on steroids school of thought that will win out in the first iteration of a new Obama policy, myself, unfortunately.
Questions? All right, I'll ask one more, because I've got 10 more.
Steve, let me add one more thing. The other, I think where there'll be a consensus is there's no point in lurching to a permanent status deal now. I mean, if we remember that President Bush said as his goal, we need a deal by the end of 2008. That was Annapolis. I don't think anyone thinks that. I think there's a consensus that you should try and create the conditions for a deal. What I'm floating as a question is, can one decouple, can one de-link ending the occupation from the immediate creation of Palestinian statehood? In other words, does the idea of ending the occupation have to be hostage, if I can frame it like this, to the goings-on of Palestinian politics? Is it more realistic, perhaps, to say, let's get a border, let's get the Israelis out, whether settlements some stay behind or not. Let's create a new security reality there that is not an Israeli security reality, that is an international security reality. And that you begin to build Palestinians, the institutions and the texture of Palestinian statehood under an international umbrella rather than under Israeli occupation.
In both Gaza and the West Bank?
You can only do it in both Gaza and the West Bank if at the same time you're reconstituting a source of Palestinian national legitimate authority. In other words, if you're doing the reuniting thing. And that comes back to the region. I would say if you manage to get, we haven't mentioned the word Syria, we haven't mentioned the word Iran either. If you manage to get Syria, Qatar, Turkey, Saudi, Jordan, Egypt in a room together, all saying we need to recreate a Palestinian national movement that can over time assume authority, then I think Fatah and Hamas will come together.
So Daniel, can you expand on that just a moment? Beyond the countries you just articulated, where are other sovereign roles in this resolution? I mean, you both have spoken at length about the special envoy, but where do other countries come into the mix? Or is the reliance on the Obama euphoria so acute that it's going to start there and stop there and not expand? I mean, where do the Europeans and the Russians and other interested parties reside in all of this?
My slightly cute answer, and I'd be interested in what Amjad says, would be that if you're talking about their role in a deal-making scenario, not in an ongoing particular problem management, their role is pretty much where America inserts them. I think it is that blunt. You will not get a game-changing, deal-making European or Russian or any other international actor driven that can deliver, that is credible. That might not be true totally of the Arab side, but Arab states, yet alone collective Arab League, public diplomacy has been shown time and time again to have severe limitations of capacity. I don't know. You agree with that?
I agree in general. We've blocked the door to anybody else interfering on this issue or trying to play a role unless they had our support. And so we've said basically, if you're going to play a role, we want you to concentrate on improving the flow of goods through these checkpoints. We want your country to concentrate on building up the Palestinian prison system. We want your country to, and by all, and what was frustrating for me was I would actually travel more to European countries than I would to the United States when I was advising the negotiating team. And they would start every meeting with, man, isn't the American policy a disaster? Oh, it's so horrible. I don't know when you're going to get rid of this president. It's just a mess. Anyway, this is what they want us to do. and then they would proceed to say what it was that they were going to have to be engaged in. And after a while, it became you'd stop them at the beginning of the sentence. It's like, you know what? I don't need to hear about my president. Actually, I'm just sort of curious as to why you're doing what he's asking you to do. And I don't think that that's going to change on this issue. It's going to change only for those countries that have domestic constituencies that make this a vital concern for them. And so they have to interfere where they see the United States. It was interesting in the last days of the Bush administration, lots of people started getting involved all of a sudden. I mean, Sarkozy was getting involved. Everybody was all of a sudden, it was in the absence of the United States, in the absence of instructions that you can't, everybody tried to play a role. I think it shows that there's significant, we could have a very significant safety net of support if we wanted it.
And people did step into the vacuum, but there was only so far they could go without the US. Qatar played a key role in brokering the internal Lebanese accord,
Right.
which allowed there to be a unity government and has set up the elections. Turkey is mediating between Israel and Syria, but it could only go so far without the US. Egypt is mediating between Israel and etc. But there are certain pieces of this which can only go so far without.
Zach.
There's been so much focus for so long on U.S. policy as a crucial aspect of the region, and obviously an appointment of a very high-profile special envoy at the very beginning of the administration reinforces the critique of earlier policy was ineffectual and more engagement is necessary. Just entertain the possibility that less engagement is necessary, and that the degree of intensive U.S. involvement has been not a mediating factor, but an aggravating one. And what would the consequences be of radical disengagement? Not that I feel for one moment that that's either on the table, part of the discussion, or going to happen, but it's at least worth entertaining that as the path not taken, but the option that should be.
I mean, well, one short answer for me is that radical disengagement for us on a conflict like Sri Lanka means that we've pulled out of picking sides and we've pulled out of actually trying to work on either.
Daniel doesn't want to do it.
Yeah,
I'm running away.
Daniel doesn't like
when Zach asks questions, I run away.
When he doesn't like the question, he leaves. Did you unplug yourself from the mic? But on this issue, though, when we disengage ourselves, we're actually providing Israel with a blank check, and that's how it's going to be perceived, even if that wasn't the intention of doing it. I would actually agree if the point is, though, I'm inclined to agree with the idea that some people say that intense engagement that fails is worse than not engaging and failing. And so it's one thing for everybody to think that we failed because we didn't pay attention. It's another to think that we didn't have the power or the smarts or the ability to end this conflict or to pursue our own national security interests. And that's one of the things that I'm actually very worried about with President Obama. I was telling Steve earlier, in the region, there seems to be this kind of, he's the last best hope. I mean, America has this administration to end this crisis or to end this conflict according to a negotiated settlement and 22 Arab states signing peace deals with Israel and a kind of transformative Middle East. And if he can't do it, then the only alternative is resistance. The only alternative is to accept the argument of Hezbollah and Hamas and others that you'll only achieve your rights through active resistance against Israel. And that idea is very destabilizing to governments that are expressly opposed to that policy. And so I'm afraid that, you know, again, it's unfair to him that he's inherited this mess at this stage in time, but he's also, of course, chosen to become our president at this time.
Can I understand exactly?
Yeah, I mean, on the radical disengagement, though, you would tie that to aid at some point. I mean, I agree that, you know, if you continue massive aid, then radical disengagement could be seen as, well, not really a blank check, a check that's worth about $2.5 billion. But if you did tie it to aid, or if you disengaged aid, then that would be...
Yeah.
In Israeli terms, it has a dramatic and liberating effect.
Yes.
I mean,
Yes.
but only if you go through with the consequences. With American policy, in terms of how it plays out in Israel, is that it's the facilitator for Israel. It facilitates a constant Israeli capacity to postpone making hard decisions, the postponement of which are leading Israel into a very, very dangerous place. So radical disengagement in that respect would force Israel to make those decisions. But you stop vetoing resolutions at the UN, you stop aid, you stop key parts of the special relationship. I mean, I think for me it's not the special relationship that's a problem, it's the way it's structured, and as I say it, the way it facilitates this postponement, which serves neither Israel nor the US, I would argue. I don't think there is a domestically politically viable version of a you take responsibility, really, type of radical disengagement. Is there a domestically politically viable version of America carries Israel over the finishing line by helping to end the imaginary option of postponing hard decisions? I don't know. I think it's more likely than that kind of radical disengagement.
So we're just about at the end, and